Here at the Canadian Club, we have always been a forum for public figures, thought leaders, and decision makers to share their ideas and inform the most relevant and compelling conversations of our time.
We are dedicated to encouraging debate on the issues that matter to this city, this province, and this country.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon, Canadian Club members and guests. What a privilege it is here to be with you in person today. I certainly hope for those of you in the room that you enjoyed your meal and took advantage. I think it was clear that everyone was taking advantage of the time to reconnect with old friends and possibly make some new ones as well. My name is Joseph Lowe, President of Canadian Club Toronto, and I'm very delighted to be your host today. I appreciate those of you who have taken the time to join us online, thanks to the AV services of Van Valkenburg Communications, as well as MediaEvents.ca. Our tickets for our in-person event sold out in just days, so we're certainly happy to be able to extend the platform to our audience digitally as well. We are also deeply appreciative of the generous sponsorship provided by Hydro One and Fasken, so thank you, Chris and Daniel, for making this event possible. And thank you to our season sponsor, Canadian Bankers Association, for their continuing support. I'd also like to thank Canada's Forest Trust and ESG company planting smart forests to take action on climate change with the power of nature. I'm pleased to share that our partnership will reduce the carbon footprint of our entire season of Canadian Club Toronto events. And now for our program. Preparing for our conversation today, I was struck by the clarion call in Prime Minister Trudeau's mandate letter to the Minister of Natural Resources, and I will quote here. The science is clear. Canadians have been clear. We must not only continue taking real climate action, we must also move faster and go further. Building a cleaner, greener future will require a sustained and collaborative effort from all of us. As Minister, I expect you to seek opportunities within your portfolio to support our whole of government effort to reduce emissions, create clean jobs, and address the climate-related challenges communities are already facing. So as a Canadian and a father of two young boys, I can't wait to hear how Minister Wilkinson will be answering or is already answering this call. And so, what questions do you have for Minister Wilkinson? You will find in the room Q&A cards right on your tables and a pen. Feel free to fill those out. We'll pick them up and get them to the front for moderation, to our moderator, Dan Moulton. And for those of you joining us online, you can do the same. Hit the question button on the right-hand side of the screen, and we'll funnel in your questions that way as well during the broadcast. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. The Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson has the right stuff to lead a complex governmental portfolio that requires collaboration across multiple ministries to realize the more than 23 deliverables in his mandate letter. That is truly impressive. That is exactly 20 more things than I can handle at any one time. For the past 7 years, he has represented North Vancouver on Parliament Hill. Minister Wilkinson's previous portfolios make him a natural for his current role. He has served as Minister of Environment and Climate Change and Minister of Fisheries, Oceans, and the Canadian Coast Guard. During his career in the private sector, he worked with companies that were dedicated to the development of green technologies. He was CEO of both Quest Air Technologies and what is now known as BQE Water. His senior leadership role with Nextera gave him deep experience in the energy and environmental tech sectors. After Minister Wilkinson completes his remarks, my colleague, Canadian Club Director Dan Moulton, will join the Minister in conversation and also to moderate your questions. Mr. Minister, the Canadian Club podium is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone. C'est un plaisir d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. Merci au Canadian Club Toronto pour son accueil. It is always a pleasure to be back in Toronto. I grew up in Saskatchewan. I think David Hurley's here. We talk about that a lot. And I now live in British Columbia, but I was actually born in Ontario. I was born in the Sioux. I spent my early youth in Moosonee, if you can believe it. And I actually spent a number of years living here in Toronto working for a company called Bain & Company, and so it's always nice to be back here in Toronto. I want to begin by recognizing that we are meeting on the traditional and ancestral territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I would also like to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. I also want to recognize one of my colleagues who's here in the room, Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, who is a fantastic representative for beaches here in Toronto and helps me regularly to ensure that I'm doing the right thing in Ottawa. Regularly, so. Let me start this discussion by saying that I believe that Canada is uniquely placed to take advantage of the major areas of growth that are going to be driven by the transition to a low-carbon future. What we need at this moment in our history is a thoughtful, collaborative, and ambitious economic strategy that will create wealth and good jobs in every region of this country, while ensuring that we meet our ambitious and necessary climate goals. In this day and age, I don't believe there's any real debate in any province or territory about the reality nor about the causes of climate change. The scientific consensus is overwhelming, and it has been for many years now. I believe that the vast majority of Canadians in every province and territory understand the reality of what kind of world we will be leaving to our children if we do not address the climate issues in thoughtful and substantive ways. I also believe that in each and every province and territory in this country, our citizens are looking for their leaders to get on with building an economy that will serve our needs and will protect the planet for the long term. However, where there is, and there should be, vigorous discussion and debate is how we make progress on reducing carbon emissions in line with what science tells us we must. True collaboration, almost by definition, requires compromise. It may seem obvious, but it bears stating that we simply cannot have a functioning federation without a fair degree of compromise. This applies to pretty much every file in government. But while we can and should compromise with each other, we cannot compromise with science. So we must remain united in our objective of lowering emissions at a pace and a scale that is consistent with what science tells us we must do in order to ensure a livable planet for future generations. But by all means, let us debate, let us collaborate, and let us compromise on the pathways to get there. It is in this context I'd like to talk about two broad subjects. First, the brutal and unjustified invasion of the ongoing war in Ukraine and the implications of this conflict for critical issues around energy security, affordability, and yes, climate change. And second, Canada's economic future in the context of climate change, namely how we can work to ensure that all regions of Canada secure the jobs, economic opportunity, and prosperity that are available in the transition to a low-carbon future for those who act thoughtfully and early. Commençons par l'Ukraine. As you well know, the effects of the war in Ukraine are having significant implications well beyond Europe. Because of Russia's illegal invasion, energy affordability and security are now at the forefront of international affairs. I was saying in the conversation over lunch that Natural Resources Canada is typically a department that is quite domestically focused. It is no longer domestically focused. Half of the job in this portfolio is related to international energy security issues. The conflict has exposed the vulnerability of global markets and impacted the supply chains for many other key commodities and industries. Significant volatility in energy markets have resulted in elevated and unstable pricing. The energy security implications for Europe are potentially devastating. For the Europeans, this isn't just a matter of inconvenience. This is about a fundamental threat to their ability to provide the basics for their citizens: heat for their homes, fuel to transport food and goods, power to sustain their industries. Not surprisingly, Western European countries are working vigorously to secure predictable energy supplies in the context of what is an increasingly belligerent Russia. In the short term, Europe is looking to replace Russian energy imports with those from other countries, while concurrently aggressively accelerating a transition toward non-emitting and more secure forms of energy, including renewables, hydrogen, and nuclear. Europe's efforts to transition to non-Russian sources of oil and gas, reduce consumption, and shift to renewables and hydrogen is not sequential. They are looking to do all of these things concurrently. And as part of these efforts, they have asked for help from their friends. And Canada has responded. We were the first country in the world to ban imports of Russian oil and petroleum products. We then worked with industry to increase oil and gas exports in the short term by about 300,000 barrels a day equivalent by the end of 2022, and we are on track to meet those numbers. Europe has also asked us to look at how Canada could potentially assist with liquid natural gas and hydrogen from Eastern Canada, which is why we have established active working groups with Germany and with the European Union. I should also note that liquid natural gas from the west coast of Canada can also assist our European friends by providing enhanced supply to global markets, which essentially will allow the displacement of gas and more gas to be available to our friends in Europe, even though we are shipping largely to Asia. LNG Canada, which is currently being built, will do precisely this. It will be one of the world's lowest GHG emission intensity LNG projects. A second BC LNG facility, Woodfibre, has also received regulatory approval and offers an even lower emissions profile because they use electricity to liquefy the gas. Beyond LNG, we are also assessing Canada's ability to enhance the export of other strategic commodities that have typically been provided by Russia and Belarus, including things like potash and uranium. And we are discussing actively opportunities to assist with nuclear energy with a number of European Union members. Given these undertakings, there are some who have raised questions about how tackling energy security and addressing climate change can be reconciled. And to that, I would just say that, of course, we need to respond to the calls for assistance from our European friends. But, of course, we also need to ensure that we stay focused on aggressively addressing the existential threat that climate change poses. To posit that Canada can do only one of these two critically important things represents, in my mind, a failure of leadership. Indeed, Canada is presently assessing and discussing what more it can do to assist our European partners, but we are doing so in a manner that accounts for and seeks to minimize additional domestic emissions and ensures that any net additional emissions fit within the context of our climate commitments to our international partners. As a nation, as a people, surely we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can help our European friends in the short term and achieve our ambitious and vital climate goals. And we can address both in a manner that seeks to keep energy affordable for Canadian families. J'aimerais également partager quelques réflexions sur la transition énergétique. I find that there is often a distinct lack of clarity about what the energy transition is fundamentally about and the role of hydrocarbons fuel through this process. In virtually all forecasts, global demand for oil is projected to be relatively flat through 2030, potentially even 2035, before we start to see a decline in the consumption of oil associated largely with the deployment of zero-emission vehicle technology. And while the volume of oil consumed globally will eventually decline significantly, even in the International Energy Agency's 1.5-degree scenario, the world will still use about 25 million barrels of oil in 2050. That's about a quarter of the oil we consume today. What will change is that by 2050, we're going to stop burning oil and gas. In a net zero world, significant amounts of oil will continue to be needed, but will be used in non-combustion applications such as petrochemicals, asphalt, lubricants, solvents, and waxes. Similarly, for natural gas, the IEA forecasts the demand for natural gas in 2050 will be half of what it is today, but again for use in non-combustion applications such as ultra-low carbon hydrogen production. At the end of the day, the cause of climate change is not fossil fuels themselves. It is carbon emissions associated with the production and the combustion, or the burning, of fossil fuels. Beyond the need for very significant increases in the use of renewables and other forms of non-emitting energy, the reality is that there will continue to be a role for some level of hydrocarbons post-2050. And during the coming 30-year period of transition, during which some volume of hydrocarbon combustion will continue to exist, and even beyond 2050, when we have largely eliminated fossil fuel combustion, countries that focus on producing hydrocarbons with ultra-low production emissions are likely to be the last producers standing, which underlines the critical economic necessity of taking strong action to reduce emissions from Canada's oil and gas sector. Let me just reiterate that point. Aggressive action to reduce emissions from the production of oil and gas is critical for any producing country that wishes its resources to be relevant in the energy transition and in the coming low-carbon future. So Canada can and must seize the economic opportunities of the energy transition to a low-carbon future and ensure an affordable and prosperous future for all Canadians, all against this geopolitical, climate, energy, and economic backdrop that I've just discussed. Even before the events of the last few months, the global economy was changing, and it was changing very rapidly, and that change is only going to accelerate. Around the world, financial markets are increasingly pricing climate risk into investment decisions. Smart money is flowing away from assets that are not compatible with the transition to a net zero world and towards opportunities that are. Just as any successful business must be capable of interpreting and reacting to changes in the business environment if it wants to succeed, countries must also be capable of thoughtful response and action to sustain and enhance their level of prosperity. It is in this context that Canada can choose to be a leader in the global shift, or we can let it happen to us with all of the attendant consequences of being a late mover. As the world moves towards a lower carbon economy, a key question on which we must collectively focus is how to build on Canada's comparative advantages in a manner that will create jobs, economic opportunity, and prosperity. My job, as I see it, is to work with folks like you to determine how to best utilize the abundance of resources, technology, and experience that exist in this province and in this country, and pursue those opportunities that will drive significant job creation and economic growth. To remain competitive and drive economic growth over the long term, we have to think about economic opportunities both sectorally and regionally. Opportunities from a sectoral perspective will come from new products that enable a low-carbon future, such as critical minerals, hydrogen, electric cars and buses, battery technology, renewable energy, low-carbon building products, small modular reactors, and other clean technologies. And regionally, each province has a relatively unique mix of their own natural resources, so the economic opportunities available to them, and therefore the approaches to a clean energy transition, will be different across the country. What are huge opportunities in Alberta are different from what those are in Ontario or in Nova Scotia. What we need is a plan based on comparative advantage, one that aligns the efforts of resources of all levels of government as well as the private sector, a plan that also respects the rights and the interests of Indigenous people. Canada needs such a plan that acknowledges the reality and the urgency of climate change, a plan that looks to seize the emerging opportunities. We cannot and should not pretend that climate change does not exist, and we should not also pretend that one can simply rely on technology to save us. As somebody who spent many years as a leader in the clean technology sector in this country, I am very well aware of the importance and the power of technology in addressing climate change and in growing a sustainable and prosperous economy. However, I'm also very much aware that technology on its own is not a climate plan. We should be very clear that simple slogans such as technology, not taxes, represents not only a fundamental lack of understanding of both the reality and the urgency of climate change, but also a fundamental lack of understanding of what is required for Canada to sustain and enhance its prosperity in a low-carbon world. Let us all be very careful about simple slogans and reckless economic prescriptions that look backwards in time rather than forwards. Building a strong and thriving economy is why we recently launched what we call the Regional Energy and Resource Tables. The goal of these tables, which are being launched in partnership with federal, provincial, and territorial governments, will be to identify the most significant 3, 4, 5 areas of economic opportunity in each province and territory that will be enabled through a transition to a low-carbon future. Unique opportunities that can truly move the needle from an economic perspective, not the 35 different things that we could be talking about. We are using a phased approach to start these tables with the intent of having tables underway in every province and territory in this country by early next year. We started the process with 3, British Columbia, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Manitoba. On October 12th, we launched 5 more tables in a second phase with the Yukon, Northwest Territories, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. And this morning, I am very pleased that Minister Smith and I were together in Darlington to announce that it is that we will be starting a table with Ontario. Through these tables, we will seek to establish joint goals, to align the resources that we both bring to the table, to identify areas where additional resourcing may be required, and to discuss how we better align and optimize existing regulatory and permitting processes. We will be seeking engagement with Indigenous leadership and key stakeholders, very much including industry and labor. Such strategies will enable us to better articulate the capital, labor, and skills requirements of key future areas of growth and give Canadians greater clarity on what we mean when we say the energy transition. In essence, it will enable a better discussion of what is often described as the just transition, by enabling us to have a better collective understanding of and plan for the necessary labor requirements of the low-carbon world. At times, there are some who have underlined concerns about the potential for displacement of workers as we go through this low-carbon transition, and as oil and gas begins to play a less significant role as a driver of economic growth. But if we step back and if we think about the enormous economic opportunities that are available to Canadians, I will tell you my greatest fear is not that we will have excess labor, but quite the opposite, that we will have a shortage of labor to address all of the big opportunities that are available to Canada and to Canadians. By establishing a regional table between federal and provincial governments, we can ensure that the two levels of government are pulling in the same direction towards a clearly defined set of priorities, which I think is something, to be honest with you, Canadians want us to be doing. Through this process, we can align regulations and bring to bear the financial resources of both areas of government. Beyond key areas of opportunity, a key focus for these tables will be discussions relating to how we build a low-carbon grid that will support decarbonization and provide the fundamental underpinning for the growth of low-carbon industries. As I noted earlier, the commercial opportunities presented by the global transition to net zero come from a variety of sectors, critical minerals, hydrogen, etc. But they all have something in common. They are each enabled by a reliable, affordable, and non-emitting power grid. The net zero world is going to be built on clean energy. So as we transition to that net zero world, a power grid that provides clean energy to homes and businesses when they need it, where they need it, and at a reasonable price is a massive competitive advantage. We are already seeing this vis-a-vis our American friends, where Canada has a grid that is about 82% emissions free. That is not true in the United States. And certainly some of the mandates that have been secured recently for battery manufacturing, for example, are a function of the fact that we have clean electricity and that people who produce those batteries can actually market those batteries as essentially zero carbon. There is, of course, the remaining 18% of our grid that needs to be decarbonized, and as Canadians know all too well, there are energy affordability concerns, particularly in certain parts of the country, that need to be addressed. But the most pressing challenge ahead of us is scale. If we are to simultaneously decarbonize and grow the Canadian economy, we need more clean power. We need a lot more clean power. As Canadians replace their oil furnace with electric heat pumps, we need to provide them the clean power to make those heat pumps work. As Canadians plug in more and more EVs in their garages overnight, we need to provide the clean power to charge those cars. As Canadians look to grow and decarbonize warehouses, office, factories, work sites, and more, we need to provide them the clean power to do so. And as we look to become the provider of low-carbon products to the world, including products that exist today, but can be done in a manner that is far lower carbon, which will make them far more marketable on the international stage, like steel and aluminum, we need a lot more non-emitting power to do it. The building out of the clean grid across Canada at the pace and scale necessary to enable the energy transition is an enormous undertaking. I actually view it as a nation-building project akin to the building of the railway. However, unlike that project, this significant undertaking clearly must be done with the participation of Indigenous peoples and must seek to advance the interests of everyone in Canada. Such a grid will need flexible energy sources available at all times to meet variations in demand. And even as we build up renewables, baseload sources of energy will need to be part of the mix. To achieve our climate and our economic goals, Canada must be open to the deployment of all non-emitting technologies and energy sources, but clearly each must be capable of competing from an economic perspective. Nuclear power is one source that can help address the future demand gap and help us reach our climate targets. And that is why I was very pleased this morning to join my friend and colleague, Minister Smith, at Darlington to announce federal participation in the very first commercial small modular reactor project in Canada. In closing, it is clear that the global economy is changing, and it is changing because the science of climate change tells us that it must change. And by playing to our historical strengths and acting thoughtfully and strategically, it will become a sustainable and inclusive natural resource-driven economy. Canada is uniquely placed to take advantage of major areas of growth that will be driven by the transition to a lower carbon future. But clearly what we need at this moment in our history is a thoughtful, collaborative, and ambitious economic strategy that will create wealth in every region of this country while ensuring we achieve our ambitious climate goals. I am committed to working with you and folks like you across this country to build this more sustainable, affordable, and prosperous future. So my thanks very much for having me today. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Minister. So just a reminder, please do fill out your question cards on the table if you would like a question posed to the Minister. Minister, I'll start, if I could, with some of your early comments about the global security situation and our allies in Europe. Your comments today, I think they echoed a lot of what we heard from Minister Freeland a couple weeks ago at the Brookings Institute in Washington. And I think she talked about it with a lot of urgency. And she compared the need of our European allies right now to their decision to allow European COVID vaccine manufacturers to honor their contracts with Canada, and said we have to show the same generosity. We have to respond with the same urgency and fast-track energy projects here in Canada. Could you speak a bit more about what that means and what perhaps the government's going to do to address skepticism that might exist in the market about fast-tracking those projects right now?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. I mean, to be honest with you, this is something Mr. Freeland and I talk about a lot. And I was a little surprised by the reaction in the media to the Brookings speech because, to be honest, it's not inconsistent with many of the things that many of us have been saying for quite a while. It is clearly the case in this country that we need to find pathways through which we can develop projects more rapidly than what we have been able to in the past. And it's not that other countries haven't had similar experiences than we have in terms of these kinds of things. I will tell you, when I meet with Secretary Granholm, the American Secretary of Energy, she often tells me how they look to our environmental assessment process as a model because we can actually get mines permitted and they cannot. So it's not like other people don't have those challenges. The challenge that I think that we have going forward is, A, in the short term responding to Europe, but in the longer term, it's about actually being able to get projects moving at a pace that will actually allow us to do the things that we need to do to address climate change. And I would use mining as a great example of that. Right now in Canada, it typically takes us at least about 12 years to go from beginning to mine opening. On the international stage, it's actually worse. It's 15 to 18 years. If it really takes us 12 years to develop a new lithium mine or a new graphite mine or a new copper mine, we will not have sufficient quantities of the minerals that we need to actually build the cars that are required to actually get rid of the emissions in the transportation sector. So we have to figure out how to do things better and go faster. It is something that we have challenged ourselves with. The first step is ensuring that we are abiding by the regulatory timelines in the Impact Assessment Act that we put into place. And I will tell you that is something I am very focused on. But it's also trying to figure out ways in which on the federal side we can do things more rapidly. And there is a whole process that we have working interdepartmentally to try to optimize that. But it's also these regional tables where we have federal processes and we have provincial processes. And every province has their own regulatory and permitting process for these kinds of projects as well. And often we are in a situation where the federal and provincial processes work consecutively rather than concurrently. And part of the whole process here, and it's something I know Minister Smith and the Ontario government are very interested in, is how can we actually find ways to not cut corners from an environmental perspective, not cut corners in terms of discharging our obligations to Indigenous peoples, but do things far more efficiently to get to an end state that actually allows us to make decisions on progress, on projects. On the European thing, I would just say, look, we are responding. We have responded. We are responding. I talk to my German counterpart very often and my European Union counterpart. I met with the Polish ambassador last week, and their interest is actually on a transition towards nuclear. Others, it's about hydrogen and renewables. We are certainly working with respect to some of the issues on liquid natural gas. We are very live to that, and I think it is incumbent on Canada to do everything it can to try to help our European friends in what is a crisis for them.
Thank you. You know, I would say that a lot of your supporters would have seen this federal government as being among the national governments in North America, is sort of carrying the mantle on climate leadership since 2015 up until this year. And that has in some ways been drawn into question by the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, right? There is a huge amount of demand now south of the border for action on clean technology. And there's skepticism or concern, I would say, in Canadian business communities about Canada falling behind, given the capital flow demand that comes from the passing of that act. What is Canada going to do, perhaps a bit of a preview on the fall economic statement, what is Canada going to do to make sure we don't fall behind?
So, I mean, let me say first and foremost that I certainly and the government welcomes the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, and I do think it's important that people pause and reflect. For the last 7 years, this government has aggressively pursued the development of a plan and begun to implement many elements of that plan in order to address the climate issue in a manner that actually is consistent with trying to create an economy that will be strong in the future. The United States for 6 years did very little on the climate plan at the federal level. It's not true at the state level. Some of the states have continued to move on. And so it is great that they've done it, but let's also remember that there was a long period of time where nothing was done. And so there are big chunks of the Inflation Reduction Act which are essentially catching up to many of the things that we've done. I think it's also important for understanding that the Americans are using one tool, right? In Canada, we have looked at a balanced approach where we are using pricing of pollution, which is the most efficient way to actually drive down emissions in a manner that actually incents innovation. We've used regulatory tools around phasing out of coal and around the clean fuel standard and a number of other things that essentially create regulatory requirements to drive change. And we have actually spent money. In the United States, they've made a decision they're just going to spend money. And that is because they have a different legislative architecture in that country, and that's the way in which President Biden could move forward. So there are some areas where you actually have to look at the full basket before you and assess whether there is a competitiveness impact or not when you actually look at the full basket of things. But it's also true to say that there are some areas in the Inflation Reduction Act where they've gone beyond what we have. And some of those areas, I would say, we view as being strategic for Canada. Certainly some of the things that they've done relating to hydrogen are a challenge. I think some of the tax-related measures they put into place or are planning to put into place relating to battery manufacturing and minerals processing create a challenge. And so there are a few areas like that where, you know, I think Minister Freeland has been clear and I've been clear that I think we will need to respond. I'm not going to tell you when we're going to respond, but we will need to respond because at the end of the day, we want to ensure that there is a competitive place for folks to make investments in Canada. But I also would say I was speaking with some of the folks in the White House after the IRA came out, and what I said to them is, we salute the work that you've done. You have now created a playing field in some areas that is not level, and we are going to have to look at how we level that up. But let's not get into a game where now you then go higher, and then we go higher, and then you go higher, and then we go higher. Like at the end of the day, there is a big enough market here for Canada to succeed in the hydrogen space, for the Americans to succeed in the hydrogen space, for Canada to actually have some of the minerals processing and the battery manufacturing, and for the United States to have some of that. And at the end of the day, we need to be working on this together. I think that is something that they do understand. And I think one of the positive things about the part of the energy transition is Canada has more levers in this world too. The Americans need our critical minerals. And so there is greater leverage on the part of Canada than perhaps we may have had in some areas in the past.
I want to pick up on hydrogen, because you mentioned it a few times, and I have a number of questions from the audience about hydrogen and what the government's hydrogen strategy looks like. And I understand you're a hydrogen car owner yourself, so interested to know a bit where you see hydrogen factoring into the energy transition, blue, green, otherwise. How do you see that factoring? And what is it like on a personal level to be participating in that? I'm interested in knowing.
So you're going to have to cut me off probably. I like talking about hydrogen. So I used to run a hydrogen company and was involved in both industrial and in sort of future, or at that point, future-oriented applications of hydrogen. I actually think hydrogen is, again, we have to be very clear that there are no silver bullets here, right? There are a number of different solutions to different problems. Hydrogen actually is a solution to a number of them, I believe. I think there are ways to help us both do some short-term decarbonization and in the longer term to actually fully displace hydrocarbon fuels in a bunch of applications. Like I would say I think hydrogen has a big role to play in heavy-duty transportation. I think it has a role to play in the context of home heating. It's certainly a cleaned-up version of hydrogen in place of what they do right now with natural gas, has a huge role to play in a range of industrial applications. Canada is extremely well situated, I would say, in terms of hydrogen. We have an abundance of the resources and or the technologies that can actually produce hydrogen, and in different parts of the country. On the East Coast, where we spent a lot of time with the German Chancellor and Vice Chancellor, it's about onshore wind and offshore wind producing hydrogen to export to Europe. In Western Canada, particularly in Alberta, it's about actually finding pathways through which you can actually get rid of virtually all of the carbon from natural gas. And I will tell you there are a range of technologies that can actually do that. You have to continue to do work in the upstream to reduce those emissions, but ultimately you can get to ultra-low carbon hydrogen from natural gas. And I will tell you the Japanese and the South Koreans and others are very interested in that. Here in Ontario, I think the pathway through small modular reactors is a pathway through which hydrogen becomes a reality, or a potential reality here, as both a domestic opportunity and as an export opportunity. And I think with hydrogen, you need to be thinking about both. We have to build domestic load. It can't be an industry that's only based on export. We have to build a domestic load. We need to create initially these hydrogen hubs that actually create that kind of load. And then we actually need to be thinking about how we can help other countries. Europe will never produce enough hydrogen for itself. It is going to need to import it from somewhere. Why not Canada? Japan is never going to be able to produce enough hydrogen for itself. Why not Canada? So I do think that there are real opportunities. But again, back to what I said in the speech, we have to be strategic. We have to actually be on our toes. You can be sure that our friends in Australia and other countries are thinking about that too.
Got it. A lot of questions on nuclear power. Obviously, big announcement this morning at Darlington. You also spoke at the Canada Nuclear Association I believe it was last week, and you were really speaking in no uncertain terms about the role that nuclear needs to play in the transition. Some commentators have said this is a pivot for the government. I mean, Heather Scotfield had a piece this morning saying just that.
Yep.
Is that fair?
I don't think so. I mean, again, I read Heather's piece and I thought it was interesting because I didn't say anything that different, I don't think, than what I said when I was Minister of the Environment. Look, if you think about the electricity grid and the requirements that I talked about, it's not just about decarbonization, it's about doubling or tripling generation capacity. Some of that certainly comes from renewables, from wind and from solar. But I would say, there's not enough, you will never be able to build enough wind and solar to actually do it with just those two. And battery storage is not at the stage, from a large-scale perspective, that you can actually assume that you can get rid of baseload sources of generation at this stage. We have developed most of the hydro resources in this country. There are probably a few areas where there's still some available hydro to be developed, but the big hydro developments have happened. And so if you think about the available sources of baseload power, they're relatively limited, right? Mm-hmm. And certainly some are looking at putting carbon capture on natural gas powered plants. That's possible. And hopefully that is something that can succeed, at least in the short to medium term. But you know, when you think about the scale of the electricity generation challenge, nuclear is going to have to be part of that mix. But I would also say, I think folks in Ontario are very comfortable with that because you've used nuclear power for a long time. I think people in New Brunswick are very comfortable with that because they've known nuclear power for a long time. I think there are parts of this country that have zero experience with nuclear power, and for them it's a bit scary. If you went to British Columbia and you asked them about nuclear power, I don't think you'd get the same answer as you would from Ontario. And so I do think there's a broader conversation, and maybe that's what was different about the speech that I gave, is we need to actually have a more transparent and fulsome conversation with Canadians about the options that are available, and that nuclear power is an important part of that going forward. And we need to be very transparent about the biggest issue that people are concerned about, which is nuclear waste. You know, we can't pretend that issue doesn't exist. We actually have to have an adult conversation with Canadians about how we're going to manage that. Canada actually manages it probably better than almost any country in the world, but we have to have an adult conversation with people. We can't sweep these kinds of issues under the carpet, or we do that at our own peril.
A number of questions about Indigenous equity, and you've mentioned it throughout your remarks today in the answers to questions as well. You know, I think broadly I would say, as a casual observer, the electricity sector seems to have been a leader in this, right? Hydro One, our sponsors today, announced recently a 50-50 partnership with Indigenous equity moving forward on new projects. What work needs to be done on the critical minerals development side and other parts of the natural resources in Canada to see leadership there?
So I think it's an excellent question. And I would say, and it actually, I probably should have said it before, it goes back to some of the issues around trying to ensure that good projects can move ahead, is we talk a lot in this country about reconciliation, and often we talk about services. water on reserve. We talk about governance. But I would say the part that we haven't spent enough time on, and to be honest, I think drives reconciliation more generally, even across these other things, is economic reconciliation. It's about creating an economic base that enables communities to actually provide for themselves and to have jobs and economic opportunity for the kids that live there. If you think about mining development, where a mining company proposes to go into the traditional territories of an Indigenous organization, a First Nation, and proposes to develop a big mine. And out of that, they are promised, 10 jobs and some funding for a community center. It's no wonder why many folks would say, well, why would we agree to that? But if you can find a pathway through which Indigenous communities actually have a seat at the table, that they actually get long-term sustaining economic benefits, and they have a voice in terms of how the project gets structured, it changes the nature of the conversation. And I'm not saying bad projects should go ahead, but it changes the nature of the conversation where you can actually enable a constructive conversation where in past I think we've had conversations that were not always constructive. And so we are looking very much and working very hard on financial tools that would enable First Nations participation or Indigenous participation in many of these kinds of projects going forward. And that could take the form of loans or loan guarantees or even in some cases equity, although I think probably loans and loan guarantees would be the preferable sort of pathway. Our focus very much is that. Part of it's about reconciliation, part of it's about ensuring that good projects can go ahead so that in a manner that actually is consistent with Indigenous perspectives. I think it's a critically important issue. And there are, I would say, certainly the power sector has started down that path, and it's great. I would say, even the oil and gas sector has started down this path. I don't know if you saw the Enbridge announcement a few weeks ago. But it has to be, something that we're thinking about more generally and creating mechanisms that will enable those kinds of conversations.
Good. You spoke at the outset of your remarks about a consensus in Canada on the science of climate change, and I think broadly you're right. The politics there, though, seem a bit more problematic than at different times over the last, the tenure of the government, let's say. Certainly, we're hearing from the opposition on a daily basis about the carbon tax. Affordability is a top issue on the mind of Canadians right now with inflationary pressures and interest rates. What are you sort of looking at right now as a government in the context of that political moment, right? When Canadians are feeling those affordability pressures and a conversation about carbon pricing?
So I find the debate in the House of Commons a little frustrating at times. What I would say is affordability issues are obviously very important. And they're important particularly for people who live on more modest incomes. It's not like everybody doesn't feel some of those pressures, but it's most acute for people on modest incomes. And certainly the price of energy is part of that. It's not the whole thing, but it's certainly part of that. And so, we need to be thoughtful and responsive to that. I would say one of the pinch points, irrespective of the price on pollution, is home heating oil in mainly Atlantic Canada and in some parts of rural Canada, where, given where the price of oil has gone, it's much more challenging and much more expensive for people to heat their homes. We need to respond to that. We've started to do that in a manner that is about trying to help them move towards electrification, which will lower their costs. So we just announced $250 million for that, and my view is we need to do more as we move forward. But we also need to be thoughtful about how we implement policies in a manner that actually does address that affordability issue. And, I know that some in the House of Commons like to try to create a certain impression, but the way that we structured the price on pollution, and I was part of this, was to directly address the affordability issue. Like, it's a price signal. It's a price signal to try to incent behavior change. But the money goes back. The money that is collected goes back in the form of rebates, and 80% of Canadian families in provinces where the federal system applies get more money back than they pay. We structured it that way explicitly to ensure affordability. We could have kept all the money and spent it, but we wanted to ensure that we were addressing the affordability issue in a thoughtful and substantive way. And we wanted to ensure that we could sustain the price on pollution going forward because people understood that it wasn't just taking money out of their pockets. But at the end of the day, not to be overly partisan here, but I would say that I do find it just bizarre in this world that a market mechanism that incents behavior, that is the most efficient way to reduce emissions in a manner that incents innovation, a market mechanism that conservatives would normally have said that's the way to do it, is something that is rejected in favor of massive government intervention. Like it just belies logic. So I find the discussion frustrating. I would tell you in the last election campaign, while I didn't fully agree with exactly how their platform was structured, I thought it was an enormous step forward when Aaron O'Toole adopted a price on pollution as part of his platform. That has obviously changed under the new leader. I think that's very, very unfortunate. And it's not only unfortunate for just Canadians generally, I think it's very unfortunate for Canadian industry, because one thing that Canadian industry needs is certainty. If you're asking folks to make big investments, they need to know that, for example, the price on pollution will continue, and that the price schedule that's baked into that is something they can count on. And so, we are working on mechanisms through which we can do that. You will not see the Pathways folks in the oil sands making massive investments in emissions reduction technology unless they can be sure that in 2030 that carbon price is going to exist. And so we are talking about things like contracts for differences to try to ensure that we actually provide the certainty that will enable private sector investment. But nobody wins from this kind of uncertainty. And at the end of the day, my view is the vast majority of Canadians know climate change is real, know we need to deal with it, and they should be demanding of all of their politicians that they have a credible plan that actually will address the emissions issue, but do so in a manner that will incent and create an economy that can be strong and prosperous in the future.
Thank you. I got a signal we've got to wrap up soon, so I'll ask you one last quick question. Okay. Any book reviews? What are you reading right now?
Oh my God. I will tell you, I would love to be reading more books. I actually go home with like 4 binders every night. And my chief of staff is sitting there, she can tell you. So I typically am simply reading everything that folks give me. I was given a book yesterday that I am going to read, but I haven't read anything in the last couple of months other than the stuff that actually comes out.
A lot of briefing books. Understood.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Minister.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. To offer a formal thank you to the Minister, I'd like to welcome Chris Lopez, CFO, Hydro One.
Okay, I could see the passion there, Minister Wilkinson, and your deep knowledge of the power industry and the transition is admirable. Minister Wilkinson, thank you for your inspiring remarks on the energy transition and the opportunities for Canada to show leadership, not just provincially, federally, but globally on the international stage. The 2 announcements you made today are certainly encouraging. The first one this morning in terms of support for the SMRs, small modular reactors, will help us not only in Ontario, but to take that technology across Canada and then ultimately across the globe, as you heard earlier on, mostly in Eastern Europe, are very interested. And the second one is in regard to the Ontario government entering the roundtable. I think there's nothing better than identifying what's unique about each province and then encouraging them to come to the federal table and work out the unique solution that will be required for them to be successful in the new global economy. Hydro One is very pleased to be a lead sponsor today. We share your commitment to enabling the energy transition. As you know, Ontario already has a great story. I heard you say around the 80%. Well, with over 90% clean electricity, we're attracting businesses who are striving to meet their net zero targets. And I agree with your comments around we have a unique proposition here in Ontario to bring EV manufacturers. We already have the vehicle manufacturing capability. We've got a very clean grid, and now we've got the minerals to supply that, which I do believe is the competitive advantage because they will come in short supply. The Chinese were very good at monopolising it, and Ontario has been gifted with a really good opportunity here. As an industry, we expect to see more change in the next 10 years than we've seen in the previous 100. Daunting, but also very exciting. Coming from a background in both mining and power utilities, I'm excited to see how together the 2 industries can and will enable electrification and the clean economy in Ontario, Canada, and globally. As we look ahead, it's critical that we have the necessary infrastructure in place to electrify our economy so we can enable customer expectations and carbon reduction goals. In Ontario, Hydro One is developing critical transmission projects to support growing demand, electrification, and the supply chain for electric vehicles, which I spoke about earlier. Building new transmission requires Indigenous participation. I heard your comments today and I couldn't agree more. And we are proud to have recently announced a new industry-leading 50-50 equity partnership model with First Nations. True partnership where they're at the table with an equal say. For all new capital transmission line projects with a value exceeding $100 million. As we look towards the next decade, a decade of change and innovation, or change through innovation, in support of the energy transition, we are excited to work with governments, customers, Indigenous communities, and industry partners as together we create our clean energy future, a better and brighter future for all. Thank you again, Minister.
So before you leave, a quick plug. First of all, I'll say one more time, thank you, Minister. We really appreciate you being here today, and thank you for taking questions. That's is always a highlight of these events. One final round of thanks to our sponsors at Hydro One and Fasken. And a quick plug on some future events. On Monday, October 31st, Minister Bethenfalvey, Ontario's Minister of Finance, will be here for a speech at the Canadian Club breakfast to discuss building Ontario in uncertain times. And on Thursday, November 3rd, the founder, chairman, and CEO of Vista Equity Partners, Robert F. Smith, will be our guest of honor. Visit thecanadianclub.org to learn more about our upcoming events and purchase your tickets. It's our vision to be the podium of choice for relevant and provocative conversations, connecting the business community, and promoting an inclusive and prosperous Canada. We aim to achieve this at every event. Thank you for helping make this possible. We hope to see you again soon.